A millionaire returns to the hospital early, overcome by a suffocating premonition. Upon opening the door, he sees his wife trying to smother his mother with a pillow. The shock is immediate. The truth he had refused to see now screams before his very eyes. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's continue. The morning in Chicago was waking up with its characteristic noise of engines and horns, but for Robert Miller, the sound that echoed loudest was that of his own ragged breathing. He was driving his car through streets still shrouded in the fine morning mist, feeling a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. He had left his mother, Mrs. Carman, at St. Jude's Hospital just a few hours ago, after a difficult night in which she had suffered a respiratory crisis. The doctors had assured him she was stable, that he could go home and get some rest. But something inside him insisted he go back. Robert was a 38-year-old civil engineer, known for his rationality and his ability to solve complex problems with a cool head. But at that moment, logic couldn't calm the sense of urgency taking over every cell in his body. It was as if an inner voice was screaming that something was deeply wrong, that he needed to be by his mother's side at that exact instant. He pressed the accelerator, swerving around a bus that was making a slow turn, and felt his heart race when he finally spotted the white facade of the hospital. He parked the car haphazardly, almost forgetting to lock the doors, and crossed the lobby with long strides. The receptionist greeted him, but he barely heard the words. His feet carried him automatically down the corridors he already knew all too well, past nurses starting their morning shift, and families waiting for news with tired faces. The elevator seemed to take an eternity to reach the fourth floor, and when the doors finally opened, Robert practically ran to room 312. As he pushed the door open, the scene that unfolded before his eyes changed his life forever. Patricia, his wife of 5 years, was leaning over the hospital bed, pressing a pillow against Mrs. Carman's face. The elderly woman, with her white hair and frail body, struggled weakly, her thin arms trying to push her daughter-in-law away, but without enough strength to defend herself. Patricia's eyes were fixed, determined, without a trace of hesitation or regret. It was the expression of someone who had crossed an invisible line and had no intention of turning back. Robert felt the air get knocked out of his lungs. For a split second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be Patricia, the woman he shared a bed with every night, the woman who smiled at him every morning, the woman he had sworn to love and protect. But it was. And in that instant, the entire reality he knew crumbled. He reacted on pure instinct, crossing the room in 3 strides and ripping the pillow from Patricia's hands with such force that she was thrown to the side. Mrs. Carman gasped desperately, trying to pull air into lungs that had been deprived of oxygen. Robert helped her sit up, holding her carefully as she coughed and trembled. The heart monitor blared with sharp alarms, and in a matter of seconds, nurses and a doctor rushed into the room. Patricia had backed up against the wall, her eyes now wide, but not with remorse. It was shock. The shock of being caught, of having failed, of having her true face exposed under the harsh light of reality. She opened her mouth to speak, but Robert cut her off before any words could escape. "Don't say anything," he ordered, his voice low but charged with a fury he had never felt before. "Not a word." The nurses tended to Mrs. Carman, checking her vital signs, applying oxygen, calming her with soft words. The doctor cast a confused glance at Robert, then at Patricia, trying to understand what had happened. Robert couldn't form complete sentences, but he pointed at his wife and just said, "She tried. She was..." And the words died in his throat. A security guard was called. Patricia was removed from the room protesting, saying there was a misunderstanding, that she was just adjusting. The pillow that her mother-in-law was agitated, but her words sounded empty, desperate, the pathetic attempt of someone who knew the lie could no longer hold. Robert didn't look her in the eye as she was led away. He couldn't. When the room finally quieted down and Mrs. Carman was stable again, Robert sat by the bed, holding his mother's frail hand in his. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes, and in that gaze were so many unspoken things: pain, relief, sadness, and something Robert took a few seconds to identify: understanding. As if, somehow, she already knew this. Moment would come, as if she had been waiting for it, dreading it, but knowing it was inevitable. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know." Mrs. Carmen squeezed his hand with the little strength she had and closed her eyes, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Robert felt his chest tighten even more, and for the first time in years, he cried. He cried for the mother he had almost lost. He cried for the wife he had never truly known. He cried for the life he had built on a foundation of lies and illusions. The hours that followed were a blur. Robert gave his statement to the police, explained what he had seen, answered questions that seemed surreal. How could he explain that the woman he shared his life with had tried to take his mother's life? How could he put into words the absolute betrayal, the calculated coldness, the pure evil he had witnessed? The officers were respectful, but direct. They needed details, context, anything that could help them understand what had motivated such an act. And it was there, sitting in a cold meeting room at the hospital, that Robert began to piece together a puzzle that had always been right in front of him, but that he had refused to see. He and Patricia had met 6 years ago at a corporate event. She was a marketing manager at a cosmetics company, beautiful, intelligent, full of charm and confidence. He was immediately drawn to her energy, to the way she lit up any room she entered. Their courtship was fast, intense, full of promises of a bright future together. She made him feel special, admired, desired, and when he introduced her to his mother, Patricia had been perfect, polite, affectionate, attentive. Mrs. Carmen had smiled and given her blessing, although Robert, looking back now, could identify something in his mother's eyes that day. A slight hesitation, a shadow of a doubt. The wedding was a simple but beautiful ceremony at a country club on the outskirts of Chicago. Mrs. Carmen was radiant, happy to see her son building his own family, and in the first few months, everything seemed perfect. Patricia was a dedicated wife, took meticulous care of the house, prepared elaborate dinners, and made sure everything was always impeccable. Robert felt lucky. But gradually, cracks began to appear in the perfect facade. First it was small things, acidic comments about Mrs. Carmen disguised as jokes. "She's always been so controlling, hasn't she?" Or, "Wow, your mother just can't let you grow up." Robert would laugh, thinking it was just Patricia's peculiar sense of humor. After all, every family had its dynamics, its minor conflicts. It was no big deal. Then came the more direct criticisms. Patricia began to question how often Robert visited his mother, how much he worried about her, how much he still allowed Mrs. Carmen to influence his decisions. "You need to learn to set boundaries," she would say, her voice soft but firm. "We are a family now, you and me. Your mother needs to understand that." Robert tried to balance the two women, tried to keep the peace. He reduced his visits to his mother, started calling less, always apologizing with excuses about work and commitments. Mrs. Carmen never complained, but he could feel the sadness in her voice, the loneliness that was beginning to surround her. And whenever he mentioned this to Patricia, she had a ready answer. "Robert, you can't live her life for her. She needs to build her own independence." But the real turning point came when Robert lost a major contract at the company where he worked. It was a significant financial blow, and the couple found themselves in difficulty. The bills piled up, his salary wasn't enough, and the pressure mounted every day. That's when Mrs. Carmen, with the generous heart she always had, offered to let them live temporarily in her house. It was a modest but comfortable home in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Robert accepted, grateful, thinking it would only be for a few months until they could get back on their feet. Patricia accepted too, but Robert noticed the immediate change in her face. The mask slipped for an instant, revealing something cold, something hard. But she quickly composed herself and smiled, saying it was fine, that they would do what was necessary. The months that followed were a silent hell. Patricia became a different person inside that house. When Robert was present, she maintained her composure. But in the moments he left for work or to run errands, the real Patricia emerged. Mrs. Carmen never complained directly, but Robert started to notice signs. His mother was quieter, more withdrawn. Her eyes held a deep sadness that wasn't there before. She started to lose weight, lose her appetite, sleep poorly. Once, he came home early and heard raised voices coming from the kitchen. Patricia was speaking to her mother-in-law, and although the words were measured, the tone was sharp. "Mrs. Carmen, you need to understand that this house isn't as comfortable as it used to be. We are making a huge sacrifice by being here." Robert walked into the kitchen, and the two fell silent immediately. Patricia smiled at him, sweet as ever, and asked how his day had been. He should have investigated. He should have confronted her. But he didn't. Mrs. Carmen tried to talk to him a few times. One night, when Patricia was out with friends, she sat next to her son in the living room and said in a low voice, "Robert, I need to tell you something." But before she could continue, he interrupted her, tired and stressed from work and finances. "Mom, please, not now. I'm exhausted." She closed her mouth and never tried again. And Robert would carry that weight for the rest of his life. Sitting now by the hospital bed, watching his mother sleep after the trauma she had suffered, Robert felt guilt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He had failed. He had ignored the signs, had chosen superficial peace over uncomfortable truth, had allowed the woman he loved to become a real threat to the woman who had raised him. But the guilt would have to wait. Now, he needed to protect Mrs. Carmen. He needed to ensure Patricia could never get near her again. He needed to understand how it had come to this, how a person could carry so much hatred, so much contempt as to cross the most inviolable line of all. A nurse entered the room, checked the monitors, and smiled gently at Robert. "She's doing well, Mr. Miller. It was a big scare, but she's strong." He thanked her with a nod, unable to form words. When the nurse left, Robert took out his phone and sent a message to his sister, Beatrice, who lived in Denver. "B, I need you to come to Chicago as soon as possible. It's urgent, about Mom." The reply came in seconds. "I'm catching the first flight." What happened? He didn't reply. He didn't know how to explain over the phone. Some things had to be said in person, looking into someone's eyes with the full weight of the raw, naked truth. Robert spent the rest of the day at the hospital, refusing to leave, refusing to let his mother be alone for a single second. He ate poorly, slept worse, but he didn't care. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the scene again. Patricia, the pillow, the desperation in Mrs. Carmen's eyes. And every time he opened his eyes, he had to confront the reality that his life as he knew it was over. At night, when the hospital lights dimmed and the hallway grew quieter, Robert finally allowed the thoughts he had been avoiding to invade his mind. He tried to understand. He tried to find a logic, a reason, something that could make sense of that monstrous act. But there was no logic. There was only hatred. Pure hatred, cultivated in silence, fed by resentment and envy. And Robert realized that somehow he had been complicit, not in the act itself, but in the environment that allowed that act to become possible. He had chosen not to see, not to hear, not to question. He had chosen the comfort of ignorance over the courage of truth, and now his mother had almost paid the ultimate price for his choices. Mrs. Carmen stirred in the bed, murmuring something unintelligible. Robert leaned in, holding her hand again. "I'm here, Mom. I'm not leaving. You're safe." She opened her eyes slowly, still disoriented from the medication, but when she saw her son beside her, a small smile touched her lips. "Robert," she whispered, "you came back." "I came back," he confirmed, his voice breaking. "And I'm never leaving you again. I promise." She squeezed his hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "I knew you would come," she said. "I always knew you would be here when I needed you." And for the first time since that terrible morning, Robert felt something other than guilt and horror. He felt a small spark of hope, because despite everything, despite all the darkness and betrayal, he had arrived in time. He had saved his mother, and now, together, they would find a way to get through the nightmare their lives had become. But Robert knew the worst was yet to come, the questions that needed to be answered, the truths that needed to be revealed, and the reckoning with a woman he thought he knew but who was, in reality, a complete stranger. a stranger capable of unimaginable things. And as the night deepened over Chicago and the hospital continued its routine of saving lives and witnessing human dramas, Robert Miller began to understand that his journey was just beginning, a journey toward truth, justice, and perhaps redemption. But it would be a long, painful journey, full of revelations that would change everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and human nature. And it had all started that morning when an inexplicable instinct had brought him back to the hospital, an instinct that had saved his mother's life and shattered the illusion of his own. But as the night deepened and the hospital continued its constant rhythm of care and emergencies, Robert allowed himself to delve into memories he had suppressed for a long time. He remembered the day he met Patricia at a corporate event at the Drake Hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. She was wearing a navy blue dress, her loose hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. When their eyes met for the first time, Robert felt something he thought was destiny. She had smiled at him, a smile that seemed to light up the entire ballroom, and approached with a glass of wine in her hand. "You look lost," she had said, her voice melodious and inviting. "First time at one of these things?" Robert had laughed, nervous but charmed. "Is it that obvious?" And from that moment on, Patricia had woven her web with mastery. She made him feel special, unique, as if he were the only man in the room who deserved her attention. She asked questions about his life, his dreams, his family, and seemed genuinely interested in every answer. Robert, who had always been reserved with his emotions, found himself opening his heart to this woman he barely knew. In the following months, their courtship was a roller coaster of intense emotions. Patricia was passionate, demonstrative, always planning romantic surprises, weekends in Lake Geneva, candlelit dinners in hidden city restaurants, notes left in his car with affectionate messages. Robert felt like the star of a movie, living a romance that seemed too good to be true. And maybe, looking back now, it really was too good to be true. He remembered her first meeting with Mrs. Carmen. Robert was nervous, anxious for the two most important women in his life to like each other. Patricia had arrived at his mother's house with a bouquet of flowers and a strawberry pie she had baked herself. She greeted Mrs. Carmen with a warm hug and spent the whole afternoon being the perfect daughter-in-law, helping in the kitchen, giving sincere compliments on the house's decor, asking about Mrs. Carmen's life with genuine interest. When they left, Robert was beaming. "She's wonderful, Mom. What did you think?" Mrs. Carmen had smiled, but Robert now could remember the slight pause before her answer. "She seems very nice, son. If you're happy, I'm happy." At the time, Robert hadn't noticed the hesitation. He hadn't realized his mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He hadn't caught the subtle concern in her voice. He was blind, completely blinded by passion, by novelty, by the feeling of finally having found someone. Now, sitting in that uncomfortable hospital chair, watching his mother sleep, Robert realized how many signs he had ignored, not just from his mother but from himself as well. There were moments when something inside him questioned, moments when Patricia's mask slipped briefly and he saw a flash of something cold, something calculated. But he always pushed those thoughts away, always found justifications, always chose to believe Patricia's version instead of trusting his own instincts. But as the night deepened and the hospital continued its constant rhythm of care and emergencies, Robert allowed himself to delve into memories he had suppressed for a long time. He remembered the day he met Patricia at a corporate event at the Drake Hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. She was wearing a navy blue dress, her loose hair falling in, perfect waves over her shoulders. When their eyes met for the first time, Robert felt something he thought was destiny. She had smiled at him, a smile that seemed to light up the entire ballroom, and approached with a glass of wine in her hand. "You look lost," she had said, her voice melodious and inviting. "First time at one of these things?" Robert had laughed, nervous but charmed. "Is it that obvious?" And from that moment on, Patricia had woven her web with mastery. She made him feel special, unique, as if he were the only man in the room who deserved her attention. She asked questions about his life, his dreams, his family, and seemed genuinely interested in every answer. Robert, who had always been reserved with his emotions, found himself opening his heart to this woman he barely knew. In the following months, Their courtship was a roller coaster of intense emotions. Patricia was passionate, demonstrative, always planning romantic surprises. Beatrice arrived in Chicago the next morning, her eyes red from crying throughout the flight. When she entered the hospital room and saw her mother lying in bed, pale and frail, she broke down. Robert hugged her, and the two siblings held each other for long minutes, sharing a pain that couldn't be put into words. After Beatrice calmed down, Robert took her to the hospital cafeteria. There, at an isolated table, he told her everything. Every detail of that horrible morning, every second of the scene that kept replaying in his mind like a horror film. Beatrice listened in silence, her face growing paler, her hands trembling as she held a coffee cup she hadn't even touched. "How?" she finally asked, her voice hoarse. "How can someone do that? How can someone look at a defenseless old woman and decide that's the moment to end her life?" Robert shook his head, having no answer. He had asked himself the same question hundreds of times in the last 24 hours and still hadn't found anything that made sense. Patricia wasn't insane, she wasn't crazy. She was calculating, cold, someone who had planned that moment carefully. And that, somehow, was even more terrifying than any fit of madness. "I should have seen it," Robert said, his voice heavy with guilt. "Mom tried to warn me so many times and I just didn't want to listen." Beatrice reached out and took her brother's hand. "Robert, you can't blame yourself for not imagining your wife was capable of something like this. Nobody imagines that. Nobody wakes up one day and thinks the person they share a bed with could be a real threat." "But I should have seen the signs," he insisted. "I should have questioned, I should have investigated when things started getting strange. I chose to ignore it because it was easier, because confronting it would mean admitting I had married someone I didn't really know." The two fell silent for a moment, processing the weight of that. "Truth?" Beatrice then asked, "So now what? What's going to happen to Patricia?" Robert explained that she had been taken by the police for questioning and that the authorities were investigating the case. He had already given his statement, and the doctors had also confirmed the signs of assault on Mrs. Carman. There was enough evidence, there were witnesses, there was the raw truth of what he had seen. But Robert also knew the process would be long, painful, full of twists. Patricia wasn't the type of person to accept defeat easily. She would fight, manipulate, do whatever it took to protect herself. And he had to be prepared to face not only the woman she was, but also the memories of the woman he thought she was. Beatrice looked at her brother with a determination he hadn't expected. "I'm staying here," she said. "I'll stay in Chicago for as long as it takes. Mom needs us now more than ever, and you can't go through this alone." Robert felt his eyes burn again. "Thank you, Bea. I don't know what I'd do without you." They returned to the room, where Mrs. Carman was awake, looking out the window with a distant expression. When she saw her two children enter together, her face lit up with a faint smile. "My children," she whispered. "You came." Beatrice rushed to the bedside and hugged her mother carefully, trying not to hurt her frail body. "Of course we came, Mum. We'll always be here for you." Mrs. Carman caressed her daughter's face, then looked at Robert. There was so much in her eyes, so many things she wanted to say but didn't know how. Robert approached and held her hand. "Mum, I'm so sorry. For everything. For not believing you. For not noticing. For letting things get to this point." She shook her head slowly. "Son, it's not your fault. Some people are very good at hiding who they really are. She fooled you. She fooled everyone. I tried to warn you, but I was also afraid. Afraid you would choose me and then regret it. Afraid of being the reason your marriage didn't work out." Robert's chest tightened. "Mom, my marriage to Patricia hadn't been working for a long time. I just didn't want to admit it. I refused to see the truth because it would mean I had failed, that I had made the wrong decision." The three of them stayed together in that small hospital room, united by a shared pain, but also by a love that had survived everything. And it was there, in that moment of absolute vulnerability, that Robert realized how much he had distanced himself from his family, how much he had allowed Patricia to separate them, to isolate them from each other. In the days that followed, as Mrs. Carman recovered physically, Robert began to investigate the past. He needed to understand. He needed to know when exactly Patricia had turned into the person capable of that horrible act. Or had she always been this way and he had simply never noticed? He started talking to people who knew Patricia before him, co-workers, old friends, even ex-boyfriends. And the more he discovered, the clearer and more terrifying the picture became. A co-worker of Patricia's, named Frances, agreed to meet Robert at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue. She was a woman in her 40s with a serious demeanor and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the conversation they were about to have. "Look, Robert," she began, nervously stirring her cappuccino. "I didn't want to believe it when I heard what happened, but at the same time I wasn't completely surprised." Robert felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean by that?" Frances sighed. "Patricia was always complicated. She had this ability to be extremely charismatic when she wanted to, but she could also be incredibly cruel. I saw her destroy the reputations of colleagues she considered threats, spread rumors, manipulate situations to her benefit. She did it all with a smile on her face, always keeping her hands clean, always making it seem like she was just being honest or trying to help." Robert absorbed every word, feeling as if he were learning about a stranger. "And no one confronted her?" "Some tried," Frances admitted, "but she was very good at defending herself. Always had an alternate story, always managed to pin the blame on others. And honestly, most people just didn't want to get involved. It was easier to keep their distance." "What about her relationships?" Robert asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Frances hesitated, but then decided to continue. "She dated a guy here at the company before you, Leonard. They broke up on very bad terms. He even said she had tried to sabotage his career when she realized he was going to end the relationship. I don't know all the details, but he left the company shortly after, and I heard he moved to another city just to start over, away from her." Robert's stomach churned. He had been blind, completely blind. All the red flags were there. He had simply chosen not to see them. "Thank you for telling me this," he said, though he felt no gratitude. He just felt a deep emptiness, a sense that his entire recent past was a lie. Frances placed her hand on his, a gesture of solidarity. "Robert, nobody blames you for not seeing it. Patricia is, or was, very good at what she did. She created a persona that was hard to resist. And when you're in love, when you want to believe the best in people, it's even harder to see the truth." After that meeting, Robert felt even more lost. He had built a whole life based on an illusion, and now, with the illusion shattered, he didn't know who he was or what he should do next. But there were more people he needed to hear from. The following week, Robert managed to locate Leonard, Patricia's ex-boyfriend whom Frances had mentioned. He was now living in Austin, Texas, working for a tech company. When Robert called, Leonard was hesitant to talk, but upon hearing what had happened to Mrs. Carmen, he agreed to a video call. The man on the screen was about 40, his hair starting to grey at the temples, and his eyes carried an old sadness. "Look, Robert," Leonard began, running a hand over his face. "I'm really sorry about what happened to your mother, and in a way, it doesn't surprise me. Patricia was always capable of things normal people can't even imagine." Leonard told his story, and Robert listened in growing horror. They had dated for 2 years, and at first, everything seemed perfect. But gradually, Patricia began to show her true colors. She was obsessively controlling, wanting to know where he was every minute, who he was talking to, what he was doing. If he mentioned a female co-worker, Patricia would create dramatic scenes, accusing him of cheating without any evidence. "When I finally decided to break up," Leonard continued, his voice growing tenser, "she just wouldn't accept it. She started showing up at my work, calling my bosses to say I was using drugs that I was stealing from the company. All lies, of course, but the seed of doubt was planted. My reputation was destroyed. I had to leave the company, the city, and start from scratch." "And you never reported her?" Robert asked. Leonard gave a bitter laugh. "I tried, but she was too smart. Never left any proof, always had an alibi, always managed to make it seem like I was the crazy, obsessed one. In the end, I just ran. It was the only way to get rid of her." After the conversation, Robert felt nauseous. How many lives had Patricia destroyed? How many people had suffered at her hands? And why had no one been able to stop her before it reached this point? He shared this information with the police detective, who added it to the growing file on Patricia. Each new revelation painted a darker, more disturbing picture. This wasn't just a woman who had committed a terrible act in a moment of anger. This was someone with an established pattern of destructive behavior, someone who systematically manipulated and hurt the people around her. But one person was determined not to let him sink: Beatrice. She became the rock he leaned on, the strength that kept him standing when everything inside him wanted to collapse. She took care of their mother, organized practical matters, dealt with lawyers and authorities, and still found time to make sure Robert was eating, sleeping, surviving. One evening, while they were at Mrs. Carmen's house, who had finally been discharged from the hospital, Beatrice asked a question Robert had been avoiding. "Do you still love her?" Robert was silent for a long time, staring at the teacup he held in his hands. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I loved the person I thought she was, but that person never really existed. So I guess I was in love with a fantasy, a carefully constructed lie. And no, I don't love the person she really is. I don't even know who that person is." Beatrice nodded, understanding. "You know you're going to need professional help to process all this, right? This isn't something you can just get over on your own." Robert knew she was right. He had already started looking for therapists, specializing in trauma and abusive relationships, because the more he reflected, the more he realized that his marriage to Patricia had been exactly that, abusive. She had manipulated his perception of reality, isolated him from his family, and controlled aspects of his life in subtle but devastating ways. He had been a victim of a type of violence that leaves no physical marks but destroys from the inside out. And the scariest part was that he hadn't even noticed. He had normalized behaviors that should never be normal, accepted treatment he should never have accepted. And now, looking back, he could clearly see the pattern, the progression, the way she had slowly eroded his autonomy and his sense of self. A few days later, Robert received a call from the detective in charge of the case. "Mr. Miller, we need to talk. There are some developments you need to know about." Robert went to the police station, his heart heavy with apprehension. What else could there be? What more did he need to discover about the woman he had been married to? The detective, a middle-aged man with a tired but kind look, received him in his office and offered coffee. Robert declined. He just wanted to know what was going on. "Mr. Miller," the detective began, "during our investigation, we discovered some things that may be relevant. Your wife, Patricia, has a history you might not be aware of." Robert felt a cold shiver run through him. "What kind of history?" The detective opened a folder and began to read. "There are records of previous complaints. 2 different people, at different times in her life, contacted the authorities alleging she had made threats. One of the complaints was withdrawn, the other went nowhere because there wasn't enough evidence. But there's a pattern of aggressive and manipulative behavior." Robert felt as if the floor had disappeared from under his feet. How did he not know this? How had she hidden this from him? As if reading his thoughts, the detective continued. "The complaints were filed in another city, before she moved to Chicago, and apparently she was very careful in rebuilding her image here. New job, new friends, new life. It's a common tactic for people with this profile." Robert ran a hand over his face, feeling exhausted. "So now what? What happens now?" "Now," the detective said, his voice softening, "we have enough evidence to prosecute your wife. What she did at the hospital was extremely serious, and with your testimony, the medical reports, and this history, we have a solid case. But I need you to be prepared. The trial will be difficult. She will defend herself. She will try to discredit you. She will do whatever it takes to protect herself." Robert nodded, feeling a determination grow inside him. "I'm prepared. I will do whatever it takes to protect my mother and to ensure Patricia can never do this to anyone again." When he left the police station, Robert felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the truth was finally coming out, because Patricia was finally going to face the consequences of her actions. But also dread, because he knew the worst was yet to come. The final confrontation, the moment he would have to look her in the eye and accept that the woman he had loved had never existed. That night, back at his mother's house, Robert sat beside her in the living room. Beatrice had gone out to buy groceries, and it was the first time in days that he and Mrs. Carman were alone. She had recovered physically, but Robert could see that the emotional scars were still fresh. "Mom," he began, breaking the silence, "I need you to tell me everything. What Patricia did, what she said, how she treated you when I wasn't around. I need to know the whole truth." Mrs. Carman looked at her son, and in her eyes was a mixture of relief and sadness. She had been waiting for this conversation, but she also dreaded it. "Son," she began, her voice weak but firm, "the truth is that from the beginning, from the moment you two came to live here, she treated me like I was a problem to be solved. She was never openly cruel, not in front of others, but when we were alone, she changed completely." Robert listened, each word like a stab to his heart. "She would tell me I was a burden, that I was getting in the way of your lives, that I should find a place to live on my own and leave you in peace. She spoke with such a cold, calculated tone that sometimes I wondered if I was imagining things. But I wasn't. She knew exactly what she was doing." "Why did you never tell me?" Robert asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you endure all of that alone?" Mrs. Carman held her son's hand. "Because I was afraid, Robert. Afraid you wouldn't believe me. Afraid of being the reason your marriage would end. Afraid of losing you. I had already lost so much in my life I couldn't bear the thought of losing my son too." Robert hugged his mother, and the two cried together, releasing months of repressed pain, forced silences, and unspoken truths. And there, in that embrace, they made a silent pact. No more secrets, no more silences, no more allowing anyone to separate them. When Beatrice returned, she found them together in the living room, and without needing words, she understood what had happened. She joined them, and the Miller family, torn but not broken, began the long process of healing. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and pain, but for the first time in a long time, they were together, united by the truth and the love that had always existed between them, and that they knew was stronger than any darkness Patricia had brought into their lives. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, revelations, and difficult decisions. Robert found a therapist specializing in abusive relationships, Dr. Paul Harrison, a 60-year-old man with decades of experience helping victims rebuild their lives. In the sessions, which took place twice a week in a cozy office in the Gold Coast neighborhood, Robert began to dismantle, piece by piece, the emotional construct Patricia had built around him. "Robert," Dr. Harrison said during one session, "you need to understand that what happened to you wasn't your fault. People like Patricia are extremely skilled at creating alternate realities, at making their victims doubt themselves. It's called psychological manipulation, and it's one of the most insidious forms of control." Robert absorbed every word, trying to fit the pieces of his past into a new context. He began to notice patterns that had once seemed harmless, the way Patricia always made him feel guilty when he visited his mother, the way she isolated him from old friends, always finding flaws in them, always creating small conflicts that made Robert pull away, the way she controlled the couple's finances, always saying she was just being organized, but actually keeping him dependent on her in subtle ways. "I feel like an idiot," Robert admitted once, his voice filled with frustration. "How did I not see it? How did I let this happen?" Dr. Harrison leaned forward, his gaze gentle but firm. "Because you're a human being, Robert. Because you loved and trusted, and there's no shame in that. The shame is on her, not you. She's the one who chose to manipulate, deceive, and eventually try to cause irreparable harm. You were a victim, not an accomplice." These words, repeated in different forms over the course of the sessions, slowly began to penetrate the layer of guilt Robert carried. He realized he was being too hard on himself, taking on responsibilities that weren't his. And while the guilt didn't disappear completely, it began to transform into something different. Determination. Determination to seek justice, to protect his mother, and to never again allow someone to manipulate him in that way. Meanwhile, the legal case against Patricia moved forward. Robert's lawyer, Mr. Michael Foster, was a meticulous and experienced man, known for his skill in complex cases involving family violence. He had been recommended by Beatrice, who knew of his reputation through work colleagues. "Mr. Miller," Mr. Foster said during a meeting in his downtown Chicago office, "we have a very solid case. The evidence is compelling, the testimonies are clear, and the history the police uncovered about Patricia further strengthens our position. But I must warn you, she has hired one of the best defense attorneys in the city. The trial won't be easy." Robert had expected as much. Patricia never did anything by halves, and defending herself against serious accusations would definitely require the best resources she could muster. "What worries me," Robert said, "isn't the trial itself. It's what she might try to do in the meantime. She's capable of inventing stories, manipulating people, creating narratives that make her look like the victim." Mr. Foster nodded, understanding. "That's exactly why we need to be very careful. We will document everything, ensure that every interaction, every attempt at contact is recorded, and we will work with the police to ensure your mother is always protected." And that's exactly what they did. Mrs. Carmen now had a restraining order, and Patricia was forbidden from approaching her or attempting any kind of contact. Robert had also changed the locks on the house, installed security cameras, and had a direct number to call if anything happened. He wasn't taking any chances. But Patricia, as predicted, was not idle. Through her lawyer, she began to build a defense based on a completely different narrative. She claimed she was just adjusting Mrs. Carmen's pillow, that there was a misunderstanding, that Robert had misinterpreted the situation because he was stressed and tired. She painted herself as a dedicated daughter-in-law who had been unjustly accused, and Mrs. Carmen as a confused elderly woman who wasn't clear about what had really happened. It was a bold strategy, and Robert had to admit partially effective. Some people, especially those who didn't know the whole story, began to question if maybe, just maybe, it had been a misunderstanding. After all, Patricia had always been so charming, so beloved by everyone. How could someone like that be capable of something so monstrous? But Robert knew the truth, and he had witnesses. The doctors who examined Mrs. Carmen immediately after the incident found marks consistent with prolonged pressure, signs of a struggle, physical evidence that completely contradicted Patricia's narrative. And there was also his own testimony, detailed and consistent, describing exactly what he had seen that morning. During this turbulent period, Robert began to reconnect with people he had lost touch with during his marriage, old friends, college buddies, even some distant relatives. And it was through these reconnections that he realized just how isolated Patricia had made him feel. She always had an excuse not to attend social events, always found reasons for them to be just the two of them, always planted seeds of doubt about other people's intentions. One of his best friends from college, Philip, invited him to a casual dinner at his house, in the Wicker Park neighborhood. Robert hesitated at first, still feeling fragile and exposed, but Beatrice encouraged him to go. "You need to remember there's life beyond this nightmare," she said. "You need to remember who you were before Patricia." The dinner was surprisingly comforting. Philip and his wife Marina were genuine and welcoming people. They didn't ask too many questions, didn't force difficult conversations. They simply offered their presence, their friendship, their support. And for the first time in weeks, Robert laughed. Not a forced or polite laugh, but a real laugh from the bottom of his chest. "Man," Philip said when they were alone in the backyard, looking at the Chicago night sky, "I always knew there was something off about her. But you seemed so happy at first that I thought maybe it was just me." Robert looked at his friend, surprised. "You knew?" Philip shrugged. "I didn't know what exactly, but there was something. The way she always subtly controlled you, how everything always had to be her way. I tried to say something once, remember? But you got defensive, so I let it go. Sorry I didn't push it." Robert shook his head. "Don't be... sorry. I wouldn't have listened anyway. I was blind, completely blind, and part of me still wonders how I let it happen." Philip put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Look, I'm no psychologist, but I know these people are very good at what they do. They make you believe in a reality that doesn't exist, And when you're in it, it's impossible to see from the outside. But you're on the outside now, Robert, and you're doing everything right. You're protecting your mum. You're seeking justice. You're taking care of yourself. That's what matters." That conversation marked a turning point for Robert. He began to understand that his journey wasn't just about prosecuting Patricia or protecting Mrs. Carmen. It was also about rebuilding himself, about rediscovering who he was without the toxic influence that had permeated his life for so long. One of the hardest things Robert had to face was the realization of how many parts of himself he had lost during the marriage. In a particularly intense session with Dr. Harrison, he began to list all the things he had given up because of Patricia. His hobbies, his friends, even aspects of his personality that she considered inappropriate or inconvenient. "I used to be funny," Robert said, his voice filled with surprise at this discovery. "I made people laugh, but Patricia always said my jokes were immature, that I needed to be more serious, more professional. So I just stopped. I stopped making jokes, I stopped being spontaneous, I stopped being myself." Dr. Harrison nodded, recognizing the pattern. "That's a common aspect of psychological abuse, Robert. The abuser slowly molds the victim, removing piece by piece the characteristics that make that person unique, until only a diminished, controllable version is left. But the good news is that those parts of you haven't disappeared. They've just been suppressed, and you can get them back." And that's exactly what Robert started to do. He started making jokes again, feeling awkward and uncomfortable at first, but gradually regaining the lightness he had lost. He started wearing more colorful clothes instead of the neutral, conservative tones Patricia always insisted on. Small rebellions, small reclamations of his identity. He also started writing again. During the marriage, Patricia had ridiculed his writing, saying it was pretentiously artistic and served no practical purpose. Robert had tucked his notebooks into the back of a drawer and never touched them again. But now he rescued them, reading old texts with new eyes. There was talent there was passion, there was a voice that deserved to be heard. He bought a new notebook with a brown leather cover and began to write again. At first it was just fragments, scattered thoughts about what he was going through, but slowly the words began to flow more freely. He wrote about the pain, the betrayal, the journey of rediscovery. And in the process of writing, he began to process and to heal. One night he showed some of his writings to Beatrice. She read in silence, and when she finished, there were tears in her eyes. "Robert, this is beautiful. This is powerful. You have a real gift. Why did you ever stop writing?" Robert told her about Patricia's comments, about how she had devalued something that was so important to him. Beatrice shook her head in indignation. "She knew exactly how to destroy you from the inside, didn't she? She found the things you loved and made them small, insignificant. But they weren't, they never were." He started exercising again, something he had given up during the marriage because Patricia always found reasons for him to stay home. He began running in Lincoln Park on Saturday mornings, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs and clarity return to his mind. He took up old hobbies, like playing the guitar, something he loved to do but had set aside because Patricia said the sound bothered her. Small freedoms, small reclamations of self. But amidst this reconstruction, there were moments of fragility. Nights when he would wake up in a cold sweat, reliving the scene at the hospital. Days when the anger was so intense he could barely function. Moments when the sadness for the loss of what he thought he had was overwhelming. On one of those difficult nights, he was sitting in his mother's living room, unable to sleep, when Beatrice came downstairs. She sat beside him without a word, just offering her presence. After a long silence, Robert spoke. "I dreamed about her," he admitted. "Not the real Patricia, but the Patricia I thought I knew. The one who smiled at me every morning, the one who hugged me when I came home. And in the dream, everything was perfect, and when I woke up and remembered reality, it was like I had lost her all over again." Beatrice took her brother's hand. "You're grieving, Robert, grieving for the person you thought she was, for the life you thought you had. And that's completely normal. Let yourself feel it. Don't try to suppress it or rush the process. Pain needs to be felt to be healed." Robert nodded, silent tears streaming down his face. "How did you get so wise, Bea?" She smiled sadly. I'm not wise. I just love you and want to see you well, and I know you will be well. It will take time, it will be hard, but you'll get there. While Robert dealt with his own internal battles, Mrs. Carman was also going through her own healing process. She had started therapy too, working through the trauma of what she had experienced. She talked about her fears, about the nights she could barely sleep because she was afraid Patricia would come back, about the guilt she felt for having brought that person into her son's life. But Mrs. Carman was strong. She always had been. And slowly, with the support of her children and therapy, she began to regain her inner peace. She started attending the church she had always loved, reconnected with old friends, and even joined a knitting group at the local community center. One afternoon, while knitting a scarf in the living room, she said to Robert, "You know, son, I've learned something from all this. I've learned that evil exists, yes, but I've also learned that love is stronger. Look at us here. Look at how our family has come together. Patricia tried to destroy us, but in fact, she made us stronger." Robert looked at his mother with admiration. "How can you be so strong?" Mrs. Carman smiled. "Because I have you. Because I know that despite everything, we're going to be okay. And because I choose not to let her darkness extinguish our light." Those words resonated with Robert for days. He realized that his mother, who had suffered so much, who had been the target of so much hatred, could maintain her humanity, her kindness, her capacity to love. And if she could do that, so could he. The trial was approaching. Mr. Foster kept them informed of every development, every move by Patricia's defense. She continued to deny the accusations, continued to weave her web of lies. But the evidence was solid, and Mr. Foster was confident. On the eve of the trial, Robert visited his father's grave. He had lost his father when he was just 15, and since then, he had been the one to look after his mother. He sat on the grass beside the headstone and spoke in a low voice. "Dad, I messed up. I brought someone bad into our family, someone who hurt Mum, who almost did the unthinkable. I should have been more careful. I should have protected her better." He stayed there, for a long time, letting the tears fall freely. And then a sense of peace washed over him. It was as if he could feel his father's presence, telling him it was okay, that he had done the best he could, that now he had a chance to make things right. When he returned home, he was different, calmer, more centered, prepared to face whatever came next, because he wasn't alone. He had Beatrice, he had Mrs. Carman, he had true friends, he had professionals supporting him, and he had the truth on his side. That night, the three of them, Robert, Beatrice, and Mrs. Carman, had dinner together. They talked about light things, laughed at old memories, made plans for the future. And for the first time since that terrible morning at the hospital, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. The hope that regardless of what happened at the trial, they would be okay, because they had each other. And that, in the end, was all that really mattered. The day of the trial dawned grey in Chicago. Heavy clouds covered the sky, threatening rain, as if the city itself recognized the weight of what was about to happen. Robert woke up early, unable to sleep past 5 in the morning. He dressed carefully, choosing a dark suit that Mr. Foster had suggested. Sober, respectful, but firm. Beatrice made breakfast for everyone, though no one had much of an appetite. Mrs. Carman was visibly nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she held her teacup. Robert sat beside her and held her hand. "You don't have to go if you don't feel ready," he said gently. "Bea and I can handle everything." But Mrs. Carman shook her head with determination. "No, son, I need to be there. I need to look her in the eye and show her that I survived, that she couldn't destroy me. I need to do this for myself." Robert felt immense pride for his mother in that moment. She was small, frail in appearance, but she had an inner strength that was unshakable. "Then we'll go together," he said. "The three of us, together." The courthouse was in the city center, an imposing building that held stories of corrected injustices and judged crimes. When they entered, Robert saw Patricia for the first time since that morning at the hospital. She was sitting next to her lawyer, dressed conservatively, her hair pulled back with light makeup. She had clearly chosen a look that conveyed vulnerability, innocence. When their eyes met, Robert saw something in hers that made him shudder. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't fear. It was anger. A cold, calculated anger. The anger of someone who believed they had been wronged, not for doing something wrong, but for being caught. The trial began with the usual formalities. The judge, Judge Arthur Reynolds, was a man in his 60s, known for his impartiality and rigor. He read the charges in a clear, firm voice, and Patricia pleaded not guilty, her own voice steady and convincing. The prosecutor, Mr. Richard Santos, was meticulous in his presentation. He presented the medical evidence, the testimonies of the healthcare professionals who had treated Mrs. Carman, the photographs of the marks on her face and neck. He detailed Patricia's history, the previous complaints, the pattern of manipulative and aggressive behavior. And then came the moment Robert dreaded most, his own testimony. He took the stand with shaky legs, feeling the weight of all eyes on him. The prosecutor guided him through carefully prepared questions, and Robert answered honestly, reliving that horrific morning in every painful detail. "When I finished telling the story," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. Or maybe it was always there, and I just didn't want to see it. There was no regret, no shock at what she was doing. There was only anger at being interrupted." Patricia's defense attorney, Mr. Alvaro Teixeira, was known for his aggressiveness in court. During the cross-examination, he tried to discredit Robert, suggesting he was emotionally unstable, that his perception had been distorted by stress. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice velvety but with a steel edge, "isn't it true that you and your wife were going through marital difficulties, that there was tension in the relationship?" Robert took a deep breath, remembering Mr. Foster's advice. "Yes, there was tension, but that doesn't change what I saw. It doesn't erase the fact that she was trying to suffocate my mother," the lawyer continued, trying to create doubt. "And isn't it possible that given this tension, you misinterpreted the situation, that your wife was genuinely trying to help your mother, and you, in a moment of stress, saw something that wasn't there?" Robert looked directly at the jury. "I know what I saw. I saw my wife press a pillow against my mother's face with enough force to stop her from breathing. I saw my mother struggling, desperate. There is no possible misinterpretation of that. It was an attempt at a heinous act, pure and simple." The next to testify was Mrs. Carman. Robert held his breath as he watched his mother take the stand with slow but determined steps. She looked so small there, so vulnerable. But when she began to speak, her voice was firm. "She hated me," Mrs. Carman said simply. "From the moment my son and she came to live with me, I felt her hatred. She was never obviously cruel, never in front of other people. But when we were alone, she made me feel like I was a burden, that I had no value, that it would be better if I simply didn't exist anymore." The prosecutor guided her through specific examples of venomous comments, subtle humiliations, a clear pattern of psychological abuse. And when it came to the day at the hospital, Mrs. Carman described the moment she woke up and saw Patricia. Over her, the pillow descending toward her face. "I knew immediately what she was doing," Mrs. Carman said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew she had finally decided to eliminate me, and I was so scared, not for myself, but for what it would do to my son, because I knew he would never forgive himself if she had succeeded." During the cross-examination, Patricia's lawyer tried to suggest that Mrs. Carman was confused, that her medication could have affected her perception, but she would not be shaken. "Sir," she said with a dignity that filled Robert with pride, "I may be elderly, I may have health problems, but my mind is perfectly clear, and I know without a shadow of a doubt what that woman tried to do to me." Francis, Patricia's co-worker, also testified, speaking about the pattern of manipulative behavior she had observed over the years. Other testimonies followed, each adding another piece to the puzzle, revealing Patricia's true nature. And then it was Patricia's turn to testify in her own defense. She took the stand with tears in her eyes, the perfect picture of a woman unjustly accused. She denied everything, said she was only trying to help her mother-in-law, that she had been misunderstood, that she was the victim of a family that had never truly accepted her. "I loved Robert," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I loved his mother. I would never do anything to hurt her. This is a nightmare. I'm being destroyed by a terrible misunderstanding." It was a convincing performance, Robert had to admit. But he knew the truth, and he hoped the jury could also see through the mask. The prosecutor, during his cross-examination, was relentless. He confronted Patricia with the medical evidence, the testimonies, her own history. And slowly, the mask began to crack. Her voice grew harder, her eyes colder. The gentle, vulnerable woman gave way, for brief moments, to the person she really was. "Ms. Patricia," the prosecutor said, "if this was all a misunderstanding, why are the marks on Mrs. Carmen's face and neck consistent with prolonged pressure and significant force? Why did the doctors find clear signs of a struggle?" Patricia hesitated, searching for an answer. I don't know. Maybe she struggled because she was disoriented from the medication. I was just trying to calm her down." "And the pillow your husband ripped from your hands? Why were you holding a pillow over her face if you were just trying to calm her?" The room fell silent, waiting for the answer. Patricia looked at her lawyer, seeking help, but there was no help to be had. The truth was there, exposed for all to see. After days of hearings, it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor made a passionate plea for justice, asking the jury to see beyond the mask Patricia wore, to recognize the pattern of manipulation and abuse, to protect not only Mrs. Carmen but potentially other future victims. The defense attorney, in turn, tried to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that the interpretation of events could be different, that perhaps there was room for another explanation. But his words sounded empty, desperate. The jury retired to deliberate, and Robert, Beatrice, and Mrs. Carmen waited in the courthouse hallway. The hours dragged on like eternities. Robert paced back and forth, unable to stand still. Beatrice held her mother's hand, the two of them in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, after 4 hours that felt like days, the jury returned. Everyone went back into the courtroom, and the silence was absolute. The judge asked the jury foreman if they had reached a verdict. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied. "How do you find the defendant, Patricia Santos Miller, on the charges presented?" The foreman looked directly at Patricia. "Guilty on all charges." Robert felt his legs give way. Beatrice let out a sob of relief. Mrs. Carmen closed her eyes and murmured a silent prayer. Patricia, for her part, remained motionless, her face pale, her eyes fixed on a distant point. The judge then delivered the sentence. Patricia was convicted, and although Robert knew there would be appeals, that the process would continue, that moment represented something important. It represented the validation of the truth, the recognition that what had happened was real, was serious, and had consequences. Outside the courthouse, under a sky that was finally beginning to clear, the three of them hugged. There was no euphoria, no celebration, just a deep, exhausted relief that it was finally over. Finally, they could begin to rebuild their lives without the constant weight of that trial. In the weeks that followed, Robert began to truly process everything that had happened. With Dr. Harrison's help, he worked through the trauma, the guilt, the loss. He learned to forgive himself, to recognize that he had been a victim of sophisticated manipulation and that there was no shame in that. He also began to rebuild his life in practical ways. He found a new apartment, a space that would be his alone, with no memories tainted by Patricia. He decorated it carefully, choosing each piece of furniture with intention, creating a home that reflected who he really was, not who Patricia had tried to mold him into being. Mrs. Carmen began to flourish again, with the threat removed, with the truth validated. She regained her joy for life. She started cooking the dishes she loved again, having friends over for tea, tending to her small garden. And every week, Robert and Beatrice had dinner with her, a tradition they promised never to let go of again. Beatrice eventually returned to Denver, but she kept in constant contact. She visited Chicago at least once a month, and they had regular video calls. The experience had united the three of them in a way nothing else could have. Robert also rekindled relationships he had lost. He and Philip became close again, and gradually, Robert rebuilt his social support network. He joined support groups for victims of psychological abuse, where he shared his story and listened to the stories of others. And there, in that space of shared vulnerability, he found healing. Months later, on a sunny Saturday afternoon, Robert was sitting in Lincoln Park with his guitar. He was playing a soft melody, lost in the music, when a woman approached with a shy smile. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but you play beautifully." Robert smiled back and they started talking. Her name was Anna, she was a literature professor, and she had a smile that lit up her whole face. They talked for hours about books, music, life, and for the first time since Patricia, Robert felt a genuine connection with someone. He wasn't ready for a relationship, and he was honest about that with Anna. But they became friends, and gradually Robert began to believe again that there was goodness in the world, that not all people wore masks, that it was possible to trust again. One evening, almost a year after the incident at the hospital, Robert was having dinner with Mrs. Carmen. They were in her kitchen, eating the lasagna she had prepared, talking about things both trivial and important. And in the middle of the conversation, Mrs. Carmen paused and looked at her son with an expression of deep satisfaction. "You know, Robert," she said, "I look at you now, and I see a different man from the one who ran into that hospital room that day. You're stronger, wiser, more whole." Robert considered her words. "You're right. I am different. I went through the fire and came out the other side. And although the scars are still there, they remind me of what I survived, of what I learned." "And what did you learn, son?" Robert thought for a moment. "I learned that true love doesn't manipulate, doesn't control, doesn't destroy. I learned that trust is important, but it's also important to trust yourself, your own instincts. I learned that family isn't just blood, but the people who choose to stand by you when everything falls apart. And I learned that it's always worth fighting for the truth, no matter how painful it is." Mrs. Carmen smiled, her eyes shining with proud tears. "Your father would be so proud of you." That night, as he drove back to his apartment, Robert looked at the illuminated city around him. Chicago, with all its chaos and beauty, its complexity and contradictions. It was his city, his home. And he had almost lost everything here, but he had also found his strength, his truth, his redemption. He thought of Patricia serving her sentence and felt a mixture of emotions. There was no satisfaction in her downfall, but there was a sense of justice served. And more importantly, there was the certainty that she could no longer cause harm, not to him, not to his mother, not to anyone else. Robert realized that his journey was not over. Healing is a continuous process, not a destination. There would still be difficult days, memories that would surface unexpectedly, scars that would ache, but he was now equipped with the tools to handle it, with a solid support network, with a deeper understanding of himself. And for the first time in a long time, when he thought about the future, he didn't feel fear. He felt hope. Hope that the best days were still to come, that true love existed and could be found, that goodness would prevail over darkness. He parked his car in front of his building and looked up at the lit apartment he now called home. A home he had built with his own hands, filled with his own choices, protected by his own healthy boundaries. And as he walked up the stairs, Robert Miller knew, with absolute certainty, that he had survived. More than that, he had won. Not because Patricia had been convicted, but because he had reclaimed himself. He had reclaimed his voice, his autonomy, his ability to love and be loved in a healthy way. The darkness had tried to consume him, but he had chosen the light. And that choice, renewed every day, was what would define the rest of his life. In the months that followed the trial, Robert began working with support groups for male victims of psychological abuse. He realized that his story, as painful as it was, could help others who were going through the same process of discovery and healing. He began to speak openly about his experience, breaking the stigma that often prevents men from admitting they have been victims of manipulation. At one of these meetings, held in a community center on the west side of Chicago, Robert met a young man named Daniel, who was only 25 but already carried deep scars from an abusive relationship. The young man was clearly struggling, still caught between denial and acceptance of what he had lived through. Robert approached Daniel after the meeting. "I know what you're feeling," he said gently. "That feeling that you should have seen it sooner, that you're weak for letting it happen. But you're not weak. You were manipulated by someone who was extremely skilled at manipulation, and now you're here seeking help. That's not weakness, that's courage." Daniel looked at Robert with tear-filled eyes. "How did you move on? How can you trust again?" Robert thought carefully before answering. "I'm not going to lie and say it's easy. There are still days when I question everything, when I'm afraid to trust someone again. But I've learned that I can't let one bad person destroy my ability to see the good in others. I've learned to set healthy boundaries, to trust my instincts, to not ignore the red flags. And most importantly, I've learned that my story doesn't define me, but how I choose to move forward, that does." That conversation stayed with Robert for days. He realized that by helping Daniel, he was also helping himself, reaffirming the lessons he had learned, solidifying his own healing. Anna, the professor he had met in the park, became a constant presence in his life. They were still just friends, but it was a friendship that brought joy and lightness to Robert's days. She made him laugh, challenged him intellectually, and accepted him exactly as he was. And for the first time since Patricia, Robert began to consider the possibility of maybe one day opening himself up to love again. But he was in no hurry. He had learned that healing couldn't be rushed, that there was value in being alone, in rebuilding himself completely before allowing someone else to enter his life in a significant way. One Sunday afternoon, almost 15 months after the incident at the hospital, Robert hosted a barbecue at his apartment. He invited Beatrice, Mrs. Carmen, Philip and Marina, Anna, and a few other friends he had reconnected with. The house was filled with laughter, music, the smell of meat grilling on the balcony barbecue. Mrs. Carmen was radiant, telling funny stories from Robert and Beatrice's childhood, making everyone laugh. Robert paused for a moment, observing the scene around him. These were real people with genuine affection, no masks, no games. This was the life he had almost lost, that Patricia had almost destroyed. And he felt a deep gratitude, not just for having survived, but for having found his way back to himself. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert, Mrs. Carmen and Beatrice has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, discovery and reconstruction, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you the most. Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing that even in the most difficult situations, the strength of family love and the courage to face the truth can lead us to transformation. We'll see you in the next episode with another story that will touch your soul.